Yeah. So first of all, thank you, Perrine, for joining us for the Energy Forum. We're very glad to be able to discuss with you this theme, which is a sustainable development pathway for Paraguay. And we would like to address with you specifically the public policies to harness energy for sustainable development in Paraguay. So the first question, we have a set of questions which we have prepared for you today. So the first, let me just introduce it. It has to do with the vision and the challenges for a sustainable future for Paraguay. The first is, well, we know that Paraguay could be a front runner in green economic development by harnessing its abundant clean energy resources. And according to what you've learned about Paraguay in the past years through your work, what would you say is the country's main challenge towards the fulfillment of its potential as a global leader in sustainable development?
Yeah, thank you for the question, Cecilia, and thank you for the opportunity. So exactly as you are alluding to, Paraguay is one of the few countries having an electricity source that is 99% clean, which is a huge comparative advantage in today's world, in a world that is seeking to go green. The problem or the missed opportunity is that this clean electricity supply is of limited quality. As I'm sure you know, system losses are nearly at 25% when best practice is around 10%. And there are frequent outages during the summer in Asunción and in the area. So to optimize the use of its hydropower, Paraguay should invest in its distribution networks, in digitizing the grid, in smart meters, in putting in place demand side management measures to address the problem of peak demand. Could be, for instance, dynamic pricing imposed on the residential sector. Now, as many have said, and I'm certainly not the only one, from a sustainability perspective, Paraguay's enormous problem is the consumption of biomass that still makes 41% of the energy matrix and 83% of industry's energy use. So, and it seems that the main problem is a permissive or an unenforceable policy framework around the consumption of unsustainable biomass. In turn, it prevents to hit into the potential of that clean energy because of this consumption of unsustainable biomass, the clean energy cannot increase its share in the energy matrix when it comes to it's true when it comes to cooking stove or machinery needs in industry and agriculture. And that situation is quite dramatic. In combination with change in land use for cattle grazing and soil production, it causes nearly 2% of yearly deforestation, and in particular in the Chaco. So forests are an emission sink that absorbs CO2. If you cut them, you turn the negative emissions into positive emissions. And this situation makes Paraguay one of the most polluting countries in Latin America. So if you take into account land use change and forestry, Paraguay ranks second after Guyana in terms of emission per capita. And that's quite paradoxical for a country whose electricity is mostly clean. And what is more interesting, heating in urban buildings also mostly electrified, which is quite rare in countries.
Well, thanks for that reflection, Perrine. Are there any countries or success stories which you have learned about or worked with in the past years, which could be worth emulating for Paraguay?
Yeah, there are many, but you wouldn't believe that I would take a country in Africa like Kenya, and which is a country much poorer than Paraguay. But it's a country that is at the forefront of climate policy, electricity reform, and digitization. And this is all thanks to a conducive policy environment. For instance, Kenya was one of the first countries to liberalize its power sector, and it has allowed independent power producers already since the 90s. In 2008, it introduced feed-in tariff to incentivize IPPs. It also undertook to de-risk the geothermal investment by investing in a state-owned company that would undertake geothermal exploration in order to de-risk the investment. So as a result, Kenya is now a leader in geothermal. This is quite impressive. Another thing is that thanks to forward-looking information and telecommunications technology policies, which is called ICT policies, it's one of the fastest growing ICT markets, with ICTs having already increased productivity throughout the economy and contributing to raising the standards of living of Kenyans. And thanks to these policies overall, Kenya has developed the off-grid market for solar because now households can buy mobile payments through small increments, which makes it more affordable to pay for off-grid solar. So I find Kenya a fascinating case study. They've had forward-looking policies in a very constrained environment, obviously. This is a poor country. And this is all about seeing the future and taking advantage of the country's comparative advantage.
That is indeed a fascinating example, which I'm sure most of us don't hear about every day, especially because there's not much, not many news come this way about Africa and what the success stories are there. So thank you for sharing that with us. So in terms of tapping into this asset, which you were rightly mentioning, I'm just focusing again on the transformation of the energy mix, the energy matrix, which you were mentioning in Paraguay. And could you name two specific strengths and two weaknesses you have identified in this regard in order for Paraguay to be able to transform its mix by 2030 and beyond?
Yeah. So Paraguay adopted right that sustainability and energy agenda, and I think that agenda lays the emphasis on many things. But again, this agenda reiterates the fact that the country is missing a strong Ministry of Energy that has strong administrative capacity, oversight over the utilities, and a long-term vision. And without the strong institutional setup, Paraguay won't be able to implement any sustainable energy agenda. I think you wrote yourself, Cecilia, I think I really enjoy your publication that already 5 bills were drafted to set up such a ministry, and it didn't go too far. There is one sitting in Parliament right now, and I think it is really time for leadership to lift the political roadblocks that have failed this bill so far. In addition, thanks to you, Cecilia, and I think I understand that the public is not really supportive of bills creating new ministries. They see it as contributing to possibly administrative burden, corruption, patronage. So it's time to embark on a communications campaign with the public to sensitize the public on how the lack of a strong Ministry of Energy is associated with their daily problems when it comes to electricity, outages, and so on. I think another strength and need of a sustainability energy agenda is insisting on the fact that the country needs strong government regulations for efficiency, in particular in buildings. There is very little going on in that regard. And it's very problematic, and that's a missed opportunity. We found an interesting study showing that there is great potential for savings with efficiency measures applied to home appliances, like lighting, air conditioning, food conservation, water heating. And that study anticipates that if these measures are in place, by 2040, the country could save $3 billion just by saving on electricity supply. So there is a lot to gain from efficiency, and it is a pity that right now there is little policy framework in place to tackle this problem.
Thanks for that reflection too, Perrine. I think it sheds light on the main strengths and the weaknesses that the country has or needs to face, to embrace this future. Um, so, I mean, besides the internal factors which you just mentioned, what do you consider to be the potential threats that could hamper progress in this front in the next decade? Looking at the regional developments, the global developments, and the current COVID situation, and other factors which you might like to factor in this reflection.
Yeah, thank you, Cecilia. I think one external factor, external threat that I want to discuss here is climate change. And climate change will decrease the water flows coming out of Paraguay's dams, which might create a deficit of power supply even sooner than currently anticipated. And I would be it would be very detrimental for the country to retrograde and fill that gap with non-economical, non-sustainable thermal energies, as is suggested in some studies. Even in the sustainable energy agenda of the country, I saw that there is a call to strengthen the hydrocarbon sector through strengthening petropower. And that's just not really a sustainable bet. And that would be a wrong choice that will just lock in capital in the hydrocarbon sector. So I think the country should start planning and considering solar energy seriously, and more seriously than it has done so far, because the cost of this energy is not very competitive with the cost of hydropower. And on top of it, there is complementarity between solar and hydropower. In some studies, in some analysis, hydropower is really seen as the virtual battery of solar, which is very interesting. And some very forward-looking studies, but which which might just illustrate something that will become a reality soon. It is considered that floating solar plants can be put on hydro dam to save on water evaporation from the dam and land occupation, because solar is very land intensive, and at the same time optimizing the complementarity between solar and hydro. So these are really interesting developments coming from abroad that should be taken advantage of, and the threat of climate change should be turned into an opportunity through what the energy transition has to offer.
That's great to hear, because I mean, it's not only about the threats that come from outside, but also the new technological developments which we might be able to grab and trying to implement here. So that's very interesting, Perrine. And so finally, I'd like to go down to a more granular level and talk about potential goals, strategies, and actions, because I'm sure you're very familiar with the policy framework we have in Paraguay, with the sustainable agenda, with energy policy, and even the sustainable development plan. If you could pinpoint one specific midterm action that the country could adopt to advance towards a more sustainable future, what would it be?
Yeah, thank you, Cecilia. I mean, I think there are many things to do in the short term before thinking of midterm actions. And I would start with having a sustainability energy agenda or national policy that targets net zero emissions by 2050. So right now, the sustainability agenda and the national energy policy leads us to reduce emission as compared to the business as usual scenario. But this agenda still leads to an increase in absolute emission by 2040 as compared to 2019. So that's not really possible, and it's really in contradiction with the direction of the world agenda set by the Paris Agreement. So I'm hoping that the study that we are developing right now with your help, CRECE, will support this effort. And right now Paraguay is not fully equipped with the right institutional policy and legal framework to curb its emissions and reap the benefits of the energy transition. There is still a lot to do there.
Thank you, Perrine. So that's interesting because we always think in terms of the many actions in the short, mid, and long term, and so it will be interesting to we're very eager to see the final result of the report that you're preparing, and I'm sure that will bring about a lot of new developments for us to work with. So now we were talking about specific actions. And what about the strategies that you think that the country should enact or focus on in order to become global leader in sustainable development by 2040? Because you were just mentioning that, well, when we compare our projected outcomes in terms of the Paris Agreement or even other instruments, that we might fall short. So what would it take for us to go beyond what's expected and actually become global leaders? Which strategies like electric mobility or storage or hydrogen and any of these new technologies could help us propel our way forward?
Yeah, thank you, Cecilia. I think there could be a strategy for each of them, but I will pick the electric cars. I think Paraguay, in general, Paraguay should maximize the use of electricity for its own needs rather than exporting it to other countries. And an incredibly useful use of electricity is electric vehicles. These are seen as luxury goods today, requiring government subsidies. By 2040, it will just become a common good that is fully affordable. Many studies show that price parity between gasoline cars and electrical vehicles will be reached within much less than 10 years, or let's say 10 years. Major car makers such as Volvo or General Motors have announced that by 2030 or 2035, they will only sell electric cars or trucks, or electric trucks. That's pretty impressive, and it gives us an horizon to target. So I think Paraguay needs to get prepared for it. And there are a few things that Paraguay could do to set the country on track to reap the benefits of electric cars. So I would think that first, there is a need to impose stringent fuel efficiency standards and forbid import of cars older than 5 years. That would progressively eliminate the polluting models from those in circulation. And Paraguay is one of the most lenient countries on that issue in Latin America. There are a few electric vehicles related bills that are sitting in parliament right now that are not being passed. I think they should be passed right away. There are targets for EV adoption for the public sector that have been formulated, but they don't seem to be followed. They don't seem to be implemented. And the private sector, there is also a need to put in place this target for the private sector. And then obviously there is a need to start planning for the EV charging station network, because without this infrastructure, obviously you can't adopt EVs massively. So the first thing is to collect data on where this could be and for whom and for how much charging. All this work, this data collection work can already be done. And last, I would say that we need to assess how much electricity will be consumed on a yearly basis by a jump in the penetration of electric vehicles and plan for this investment. At the same time, there is something very interesting to take into account, is that these charging stations could be used, could be seen as balancing the grid through what is called vehicle-to-grid technology. So if charging could be encouraged to be done at off-peak hours when Paraguay has excess electricity, then during peak demand, charging station could sell back to the grid. And it could, and that's a great opportunity to address the country's endemic problems with peak demand. On the topic of electric vehicles, possibly Paraguay could even build an industrialization policy. And some studies have suggested that. There is one interesting study saying that Paraguay could buy copper and lithium from Bolivia and Chile, graphite and aluminum from Brazil, and make batteries in Paraguay thanks to the abundant clean energy. And once complete, the batteries could be sent to integration into cars in Brazil. So in other words, with the right forward-looking policies in place, Paraguay could really harness the energy transition for its own sustainable development.
That's fascinating in a very and a very bright outlook if we get to work through these correct policies that you're mentioning, if we get to follow through on them. So again, you just mentioned some examples of where resources are located near us here in Paraguay, but again, do any success stories you've learned about, like you mentioned before, Kenya, or have worked with in the past, come to mind when we talk about strategies, for instance, to foster electric mobility in a setting which is still, frankly, underdeveloped in terms of some norms. So could you well, or maybe other strategies which we mentioned before. Could you comment on that, please, Perrine?
Yeah, so again, I will take an example from Africa, but this time South Africa, which is really similar to Paraguay in terms of level of development. And so South Africa is an interesting place because it has several comparative advantages. It is endowed with platinum, which is the key material to build fuel cell, which is the technology to use hydrogen as energy fuel. And it has a high wind and solar potential. And South Africa has understood this comparative advantage. And already in 2013, they set up a government program to promote the introduction of electric and hybrid electric vehicles. And this program brings together, this is what is interesting, that it brings together higher education institutions, science councils, mining and car making companies to accelerate the development of new technologies to support the development of EVs in South Africa. In 2014, they integrated additional international car making companies like BMW, and they set to themselves the additional goal to develop an EV charging station plan for the country. So in 2019, in 2019, you could already count nearly 140 charging stations throughout the country. And now, again, linking to the industrial policy, they want to support the development of the local industry in charging station manufacturing. So not having this being only built by international manufacturers. So they set up a venture fund to make grants to local suppliers in order for them to be able to participate in the market. So again, I find it another example of forward-looking policy worth emulating for Paraguay, not word for word, but just getting inspiration from it.
That is indeed another great example, which we might like to look into when developing our new strategies, right? Which strategies to follow in the framework of the policies. So, Perrine, and just so I have two additional questions, which I'd like to first ask you whether you're okay. So Perrine, thanks for being here with us in the forum and for going over these really interesting examples and reflections on a sustainable development pathway for Paraguay. And so there are two last questions which we'd like to make to you. And the first one has to do with your experience working and learning about Paraguay as a researcher, as a consultant. And during the drafting of the first report you worked on with the team in Colombia, which was published in 2013, which had a lot of impact here in Paraguay and maybe also in the region. So what was your impression when you first learned about Paraguay? And given that you've had experience with working with several governments abroad and with other countries, so what did first come to mind when you found out about Paraguay and the characteristics it has? Because we're pretty aware that it's not a very well-known country overall. So we're curious to know more about what your first take was on Paraguay and what did you feel at the time?
So at the time in 2013, right?
Yes.
So I think at the time, And even now, I think there is this same thematic of having a country that has certain unique comparative advantages uh, that that are not tapped into for the development of the country. These incredible dams, binational dams, this clean hydropower, this clean electricity. Already in 2013, it was tracking how the country could really uh, do much more with it than it was doing. And at the time, there was this idea of building this aluminum smelter to use this electricity domestically. And it was also not a great idea for the domestic use of electricity. Um, and 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 interestingly, at the time, we were saying, think about electric vehicles. Uh, it was a very forward-looking view because at the time, electric vehicles were very expensive and not really in sight. But we're like, prepare for it. And now it's a reality, and but we are still at the same point. But we just think that the international climate has changed in the favor of the country's comparative advantage. So, and even so, even I didn't mention it earlier, but even for green hydrogen, now for instance, Europe has a strategy to buy green hydrogen for countries, and they identified Morocco as having a very low cost of production for green hydrogen. But Paraguay could, with this so inexpensive electricity that will become even more inexpensive after paying off Itaipu's debt, uh, can also be very competitive on green hydrogen. And all these international developments were not happening at the time we were writing the 2013 report. Um, so it's interesting to see that the message that we wanted to communicate at the time is still relevant today, but with even more opportunities at the country's fingerprints to really fix the situation and harness this clean energy for its own development.
Thanks, Perrine, for that comment. And and also wanted to merge that question with another one, which has to do with the fact that you're now working with your team on a second report, which we know is looking to analyze the pathways towards sustainable development in the future. So, um, could you give us a bit more detail about what direction do you think it's going to take, or when we'll be able to when will be launched? Could you give us like an estimate of that?
I think the report will be launched by the end of this year, by the end of 2021, if not even sooner. We're going to engage soon with policymakers and even relevant academic and civil society group, and possibly, I mean, hopefully having even a type of consultation period even before the publication of the report in order to integrate all feedback.
Thank you. We're looking forward to reading it and discussing it with the broad public. So I'll just stop recording also because